Hello, my name is Paige Simpson. My group members are Kayla Swartzloff and Valerie Warner. This is our group project for CAA 3. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. This court case happened during the Civil Rights Movement. While the Civil Rights Movement was focused on the discrimination happening towards African Americans, this movement also helped open the door to begin the conversation of how students with disabilities were also being discriminated against. As brought up in this case, discrimination is a violation of the 14th Amendment. This is not only applied to race and sex, but also to someone's abilities. The solution found through the help of this court case was integration. The leading idea behind integration was that the only way a student's constitutional rights can be upheld is through equal opportunity. Some implications of this case was first making a clear connection that every student is entitled to a free education. Another implication was the distinction that anything labeled separate but equal is in fact not equal. Some limitations of this case was not bringing up the need of accommodations for students to become successfully integrated. Also, another limitation was not focusing on equity among students. Title IX Bilingual Education Act, 1969. This act was also known as the Bilingual Education Act. The purpose of this act was to give schools resources to successfully educate students, specifically students who were in low-income families and did not speak English fluently. Some implications of this case was the resources given to the schools. These resources included supplementing support for educational programs, training teachers and aides, disseminate instructional materials, and encouraging parental involvement. The biggest limitation of this case was the fact that it was not meant to support bilingual students. Instead, it was actually focused on fully integrating every student to become fully English speakers and mimic American culture. Often, this meant that maintaining the student's home language and home culture was not supported. Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, 1973. This act started with conversations that began during the Civil Rights Movement. Section 504 was dedicated to helping accommodate students that did not categorize as special education students, but would greatly benefit from accommodations to reach their full potentials in schools. Students who qualified for Section 504 are those with ADHD and asthma, to name a few. The biggest implication of this case was widening the spectrum of students that could qualify for support in school. The biggest message behind this was to step away from teaching students based on equality and instead focus on teaching students with equity. The biggest limitation of this act was not having a strong support system, specifically with the faculty at the school. If a teacher was not educated in the obstacle the student was facing and was not given the supports needed to understand the student more, then they would not be able to accommodate them adequately.
Lau and Nichols opened in 1970. Kinney Lau and 1,798 students of Chinese background were failing in school due to a lack of language understanding. It was filed by a lawyer, Edward Steinman, which first presented the courts and federal districts. Both sided with the school official, and was eventually overruled by the Supreme Court in 1974. The implication of this case demonstrated the sink-or-swim model is no longer acceptable and bilingual education must have accommodations, but applications were not well defined. The flexibility that districts had was caused by the refusal of the courts to require instruction. This caused law remedies to be placed 1 year later, in 1975, that demonstrated how programs should be into place and how they should be run. Law remedies was not federal, so the consequences for not following the structure would be a loss of funding. A federal court found Raymondville School District was not meeting the EEOA requirement in Casadena versus Pickard. The court did not support the demands of bilingual requirement. This case caused the three-prong test, which determined if schools meet ELL needs. Based on the educational theory provide appropriate material and personnel, and provide evidence of students overcoming language barriers. This case demonstrated how the courts refused to mandate an educational model and provide rights to language minorities. This case did show that students' unique needs can no longer be ignored. The three-pronged test did not, however, have specific expectations from schools in prong 1 and 2, which led to a lot of students falling between the cracks since prong 3 could not be completed until a certain amount of time passed. Doe versus Withers occurred when a teacher decided that he did not want to go out of his way to make accommodations for students, even though it was outlined in the IEP. After the ruling, teachers must make a good faith effort for IEP accommodations. This law did keep teachers accountable, but it did not set up a support system where the district can help teachers achieve these goals. Proposition 227 was passed in California in 1998. It was part of a multiple proposition known by English for the Children initiatives. It was mainly focused on immersion. Ron Hughes funded and led the idea by ignoring history, purpose, design, and research from bilingual programs. He essentially created a website full of misleading and false claims, and the emerging practices did not prove to help a student's skills. So Proposition 58 in 2016 allowed voters to appeal this proposition. Many schools still continue the bilingual programs despite the proposition being placed in 1998 in California.
No Child Left Behind Act, 2002. Students are tested annually to determine their academic growth. This law was able to hold schools responsible for how their students learn. The goal for the NCLB, which is No Child Left Behind, is to provide every student with equal opportunities into better education. This created competitive grant programs that spent federal funding to school programs. And it also created the formula grant, which started. This allowed schools to receive funding based on their LEP and their number of enrolled immigrants. States have freedom to choose their instruction methods, but must establish an English proficiency standard. Schools are then penalized if a student did not meet the standards by 1 point, or if they did not show any improvement at all. Americans with Disability Act, Amendment 2008. It was made to protect all individuals from discrimination and requires employers to make accommodations for them. This act ensures that public spaces such as transportation or workspaces or like public parks are accessible to everyone with disabilities. It also requires that any telephone company make accommodations for people who are hearing impaired or just speaking impaired or any kind of impairment that involves a telephone. Schools are required to provide ELLs with accommodations so that their needs are actually met. They are required by law to do this. Courses are required to be differentiated and provide students with options for formal assessments and giving the students options of what they want to do. The limitations with this is that it allows a very broad range of people to fall under American Disabilities Act, which adds a lot more people to disabilities. Every Student Succeeds Act, 2015. The government wanted to step in and provide a guideline for states to implement based on the state's needs. ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, got rid of the No Child Left Behind Act. These states are required to have an accountability system and take responsibility for their students. States are no longer required to evaluate their teachers based on the student's standard outcome, based on their standardized tests. They are not going to be evaluated based on that. The goals for ESSA is to make accountabilities for ELLs a top priority. ELL's test scores are added after being in the country after only a year, not the first year that they get there. But they will still be examined no matter what. The limitations are states will intervene for low performance schools 5% and under, and people tend to prioritize local and state influence over federal control. And here are our resources.